Thanksgiving Treasure, Chapter 2. As soon as I got home, I started getting dressed for the day's ride. First, long underwear, wool socks, and heavy wool pants. Then, a carefully planned combination of shirts and sweaters that would fit under my warm blue wool coat. By this time in November, the Nebraska weather was getting snappy cold. The leaves were down off the trees, the sky was bright fall blue, and the wind came whipping across the plains, carrying hints of snow from the tops of the Rockies to the west. It was no time to go out biking unprepared. I had struggled into almost everything when Carla May arrived. She was so bundled up that my grandmother hardly recognized her when she came in the front door. "Zaddy ready?" Carla May asked. "My land, Carla May," Grandma laughed. "Can't understand a word you're saying. Take off that muffler." Grandma helped Carla May unwind part of the long wool scarf that covered her chin and mouth. "Is Addie ready?" Carla May repeated. "I'm coming," I screamed from the bedroom and waddled out to the living room, dragging my boots and jacket with me. Carla May and I giggled at the sight of each other. "You look like a penguin," she snorted. "Well, you look like a fat pig," I laughed right back at her. And we both hopped and staggered around the living room, making horrible animal noises, while Grandma stood by, shaking her head in amusement. Carla May and I were best friends. She was 11 years old, too, and lived in the house next door to me. Her family had moved there 3 years ago, in 1944, and we have been pals ever since. We were always at each other's houses, having lunch or dinner together, and playing cards, or building snowmen, or just sitting around and giggling a lot. I loved going to Carla May's house because she had 6 younger brothers and sisters, and the place was always in a happy uproar. My house was just the opposite, very quiet and orderly, with just Dad and Grandma and me. I think Carla May kind of liked the contrast at my house, too. It was small, only a little 4-room bungalow, but at our house we could play Monopoly without having a couple of babies crawling across the board, upsetting the hotels, and trying to eat all the money. Our house seemed almost threadbare compared to some others, but I knew it wasn't because we were poor. It was just that Dad believed in getting his money's worth out of everything. We had had the same kitchen linoleum and the old maple table and chair since I could remember, and Grandma still cooked on an old black wood-burning range. While most other people in town had modern gas stoves, our kitchen hadn't been modernized in any way. We still kept dishes and an old brown hutch, and had the kind of refrigerator with a motor chugging away on top. The living room was spare, too, with just one prickly brown horse-haired sofa, Grandma's rocker, Dad's big easy chair, and a little writing desk where we each had a private drawers of belongings. A braided rag rug covered the living room linoleum, and lace curtains hung in the windows. Grandma was in charge of the decorating, which consisted of a fancy cake plate propped up on the mantel, a cut glass vase, and a conch shell brought from Florida by a well-traveled aunt of mine. There were a few pictures on the wall, some New England snow scenes, a print of the Angelus, and a fat baby picture of me, which I found very embarrassing. Our house was always neat as a pin because Dad couldn't stand disorder, and no one was allowed to leave any personal belongings lying about out of place. I was glad no one was allowed to look at my private drawers in the writing desk because they were a real jumble. That was how I did my part in keeping the rest of the house neat. Carla May and I went over our checklist one more time before we prepared for departure. We had newspapers and string for wrapping all the things up and tying them to the baskets of our bikes. My grandmother loaned us an old pair of scissors to cut with, and I took along my Girl Scout camping knife just in case. We would be gone most of the morning, so Grandma gave us oatmeal raisin cookies tied up in wax paper for an energy snack. I could always depend on Grandma to come up with something like cookies at the right time. She may have been a good 60 years older than I, but she understood me very well and seemed to take pleasure in a lot of things I found exciting. Since she was home all day, I actually spent more time with her than with Dad, and she influenced me in ways I had never realized until years later. She would sometimes disagree with me, but I never fought with her the way I did with Dad, and she was always there to help me through the rough spots. It was much easier for her to show affection than it was for Dad, and when she knew I was having a hard time getting through to him, She was always there to make up for it. Of course, that didn't mean that she let me get away with much. On the contrary. Now, don't go riding too far out of town, said Grandma, and stay off the highway. You remember what your dad told you? Yes, Grandma. I had heard it all before, and knew it by heart. And don't get into any poison ivy or poison sumac, she said. Yes, Grandma. And be sure and stay bundled up good. Yes, Grandma. I knew very well I wasn't supposed to ride too far out of town, but Carla May and I always did it anyway, when there was something really important at stake, and our fall bouquets were really important. This was an annual adventure for us, and we would bring back cattails, milkweed pods, bittersweet thistles, and red and gold leaves to make our special artistic arrangements. The most artistic bouquet would go to our sixth-grade teacher, Mrs. Thompson, and the other two we would keep, one for my grandmother and one for Carla May's mother. We took one last look at page 253 in our Girl Scout handbooks to make sure we could spot poison ivy, poison oak, and poison sumac, and we were ready. We pulled on our wool gloves, buttoned up our jackets, wrapped our mufflers around our faces, and mumbled unintelligible goodbyes to Grandma. I pulled a wool stocking cap down over my pigtails, made sure my glasses were on snugly, and we were off, clattering down the road toward the edge of town on our bikes. Carla May had been given a new bike the previous Christmas. Since she was the oldest, it would later be handed down to each of her 6 brothers and sisters in turn. Her bike was shiny green and had a headlight as well as a basket. We both had colored plastic streamers on our handlebars and planned to get fancy mud flaps as soon as we could save enough money. We already had them picked out and circled in the Sears and Roebuck catalog. They were fabulous white with red reflectors. The crowning glory on both our bikes, though, was the raccoon tail we each had flying from our rear fender. We had saved for weeks to buy them, and took extra care of them, and even brushing and combing them now and then. But I was ashamed of my bike. I had wanted a bike for a long time, but my father didn't believe in just handing out that kind of money to people for no reason, so he advised me to save my allowance if I wanted one. I figured at that rate I would be 35 before I had a bike. Meanwhile, my uncle in Omaha took pity on me, and he gave me an old bike that had been sitting in his garage. It hadn't been used for about 15 years, but it worked very well. I was ashamed of it because it had skinny tires. Nobody had heard of English bikes or racing bikes in Clear River, Nebraska in 1947, and everyone made fun of my weird bike. I had always noticed that it went faster than anyone else's with the same amount of effort, but that didn't make up for the fact that it had embarrassing skinny tires. Besides, it was ugly, dusty, maroon color, which Carla May and I called Icky Brick. I hated it. We set off in the northwest direction. Clear River was so small a town of just 1,500 people that we only had to ride 3 blocks in any direction to get out of town. We soon came to the forbidden highway and wheeled out into it without a second thought. If we were ever caught riding out there, we would be in trouble at home. But we did it all the same anyway. We knew perfectly well how to ride on the left and watch for traffic, and there were certain times when we just knew that we were old enough and smart enough to go ahead and do things that our parents thought we shouldn't do. Nebraska was probably one of the best places in the world to ride a bike. It was absolutely flat and always irritated us in the winter when we wanted to go sledding. There was hardly even a slope around Clear River, let alone a hill, and the only shot you had on a sled was to run like crazy and belly flop down on it. That hurt your stomach, and you didn't go very far anyway. But those flat plains were great for biking. We loved speeding along the back roads on our bikes, and being out in the countryside gave us a great sense of freedom. There were few houses outside of town, just acres and acres of cornfields and wheat fields and grazing cattle. There were hardly any trees except those that farmers had planted around their houses, and for breaks along the side of the fields, so you could see for miles. Sound seemed to carry farther out in the country, too. You could hear a dog barking a mile away, or a distant train whistle, or the hum of a big truck tire on another highway far to the north. And if you were lucky enough to ride past a meadow lark in the summer wheat, it would fling sweet notes right in right in your ear. The larks had gone south by this time of year, though, and the cold wind stung our faces as we pedaled past the brown stubble of harvest corn. 1 mile out of the highway was the Platte River, which was even more forbidden than the highway, and across the Platte River Bridge was certainly the most forbidden place of all, old Walter Rehnquist's farm. I had an idea that we would find some big fat cattails there, because they always grew in the marshy areas on riverside property like his. I headed straight for it, and not telling Carla May where we were going. Crossing the long high bridge was scary, because it was old and narrow and full of holes, any one of them which could send you sprawling off a bike. You had to get across quickly, because if the cars came from both sides at once, there was just no room for a bike to get out of the way. There was a curve at the far end, so you could see if cars were coming or not. You couldn't see if cars were coming or not, and we got off our bikes and put our ear to the deck of the bridge to see if we could hear anything coming up the road. We heard nothing, and we jumped on our bikes and we rode across as fast as we could, lurching in and out of the holes and hanging on for our lives. We tried not to look over the side of the bridge at the chunks of ice floating far below in the muddy water. When we had gotten safely across, we stopped, panting with excitement and exertion. While we were standing there catching our breath, we heard a clopping noise on the bridge, and looked back to see a classmate of ours, Billy Wilde, coming toward us on his horse. Carla May was always teasing me about liking Billy. Sometimes he was okay, but a lot of times he was disgusting, showing off his cowboy boots and his horse and yanking my pigtails being a real pain. "Hi there," he called out. "Here comes creepy Billy Wilde showing off," I whispered to Carla May. "His horse looks like Roy Rogers' horse, doesn't it?" asked Carla May. "No," I said impatiently. Carla May did not know a thing about horses. Billy's horse is gray, and Trigger is a Palomino. I mean, its hair looks like Trigger's hair. "That's not hair, Dodo, that's a mane." "Hi, what are you doing?" Billy asked as he rode up to us. "That's for us to know and you to find out," I said in the coolest tone. "Want to ride, Carla May?" he asked. "No, thanks," said Carla May. "Why not?" asked Billy. "I'm afraid of horses," she said. "Afraid?" I said, disgusted with her, and stroked Cloudy's nose. "Come on, Carla May," he said. "I'll hold on to you." "Not me," she said. "You want to ride, Addie?" Billy asked. "Will you get off and let me ride myself?" "Nope." "Why not?" "You're a girl. You might fall off," he said, giving me a smug grin. "Oh, drop dead," I said angrily. "Come on, Carla May. Let's get out of here." We jumped on our bikes and started down the road. "He's really cute," Carla May said, looking over at me to see my reaction. "Cute?" I snorted. "He's a dodo and always will be." "He offered us a ride." "Sure," I said, "but because he wants to hang on to us and squeeze us." "Yuck." Carla May laughed, and we rode on towards Rehnquist. Grandma told me that Rehnquist had lived on his old farm alone for nearly 15 years since his wife had died, and that he never spoke to anyone and had no friends. The Rehnquists had never had any children, so he was still farming his place alone. He had been selling off his land bit by bit and had sold all of his milk cows. He still had a few acres of growing vegetables, and in the summer he would come into town in his battered old car and sell corn and tomatoes and cucumbers and a few eggs to the grocery store. As we rounded the bend in the road, I saw the farm, and I knew it must be his place because his old Model T was in the yard. The big old barn stood empty, with a broken hay rack rusting in the barnyard. Near the barn was his house, a boxy white farmhouse with peeling paint, and a big porch across the front with creaky old porch swing. I knew we shouldn't be there, but my curiosity had been aroused, and I wasn't going to be deterred by the mere threat of a horrible death.